The high plains of 1885 had a way of pressing down on a man, a physical weight of silence and sky that could crush a soul flat. Nathaniel Blackwood knew the feeling in his bones. It was a loneliness shaped by the constant wind, a quiet that had filled the empty spaces in his ranch house, the spaces his wife used to occupy before the fever took her. His world had become small, reduced to the frame of his 7-year-old son, Owen, and the endless cycle of work, mending fences, tending stock, watching the sun burn out across an indifferent horizon. Nathaniel was a man made of the same hard stuff as the land he worked. His grief wasn't a loud, showy thing. It was a quiet ache, a constant throb for a life lost and for a friendship lost even longer ago. A Lakota girl named Winona. They were children together, their bond forged in the secret places of the prairie before the world came and drew its hard lines between them. He was sent away to a school in the East. When he came back, she was just gone. Her people pushed away by paper promises and cold greed. The not knowing was a wound that never healed. So he built a fortress against any more loss. His walls were routine, his mortar was hard labor, and the only person he let inside was Owen. The boy was the only spark in the gray wash of his father's life. He had his mother's eyes and a curiosity the prairie hadn't yet managed to tame. It was for Owen that Nathaniel kept going. It was for Owen he faced the ghosts that whispered in the cottonwood trees each morning. Their days were marked by chores. This morning, it was the north fence line torn up by a vicious storm 2 nights back. The sky was clean now, a sharp, perfect blue that held no memory of the violence it had unleashed. Owen followed on his pony, a small, dusty shadow mimicking his father's posture in the saddle. They found her by a washout, where the storm had clawed a fresh wound in the earth. At first, Nathaniel thought it was just a pile of rags, maybe a deer struck down in the chaos. Then the bundle moved. A tiny shudder. A jolt went through him. He swung down from his horse, his hand going to the rifle in its scabbard. It was a reflex, born from years of solitude. "Stay there, Owen," he said, his voice low. A command the boy knew better than to challenge. He walked closer, slow and cautious. It was a woman, native. Her dark hair was a mess of mud and what looked like dried blood. Her deerskin dress was ripped, and one arm was bent at an angle that screamed broken. She was unconscious, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. Kneeling beside her, Nathaniel felt a cold dread mixed with a grim sense of duty. The wilderness had its own rules, and one of them was, you don't leave a person to die. Her face was bruised, swollen, but he could see a delicacy to her features beneath the grime. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin was ice cold. He scanned the horizon. Empty. The only tracks were her own, desperate and scuffed, leading from nowhere and ending right here. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. With a deep sigh, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave her. It wasn't in him. He wrapped her in his slicker, his rough hands moving with a strange gentleness. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird with a broken wing. As he settled her in front of him on his horse, Owen trotted up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. "Is she sleeping, Pa?" he asked. "Something like that," Nathaniel answered, his gaze already on the long ride home. "She's hurt, son. We're going to help her." Bringing a stranger into his home was like dropping a boulder into a still pond. The ripples spread instantly. He laid her in the spare room, the one that had been his wife's sewing room. It had been untouched for 3 years, a quiet shrine to his grief. Putting this woman in that bed felt like a betrayal, but leaving her in the barn felt like a cruelty he couldn't live with. He cleaned her wounds with a detached, grim efficiency. The gash on her temple was deep, the source of most of the blood. Her left forearm was definitely broken, a clean snap. He said it himself, using skills learned from years of tending injured cattle. He tried to stay distant, focusing on the mechanics of bone and muscle, refusing to see the person. But the house itself seemed to notice. The air, once thick with a comfortable, lonely silence, now crackled with a new energy. It felt smaller, crowded. She was out for a full day and a night. Owen became a small, anxious guard at her door. "Will she wake up, Pa?" he'd ask over and over. "We'll see," Nathaniel would say. "Rest is the best thing for her now." She didn't wake up gently. She woke up with a raw gasp, a surge of pure animal terror. Her eyes, wide and dark, flew open and locked onto him. She scrambled backward on the bed, ignoring the sharp stab of pain from her arm until her back slammed against the wall. A low, guttural sound tore from her throat. She was a cornered animal, ready to fight for her life. "Easy," Nathaniel said, holding his hands up, palms out. He used the same soft voice he used for a spooked horse. "You're safe here. You were hurt. I found you." She didn't say a word. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the strange log walls, the quilt, the tall white man standing before her. The fear in her gaze was primal. He saw no recognition, no understanding, just the desperate will to survive. "Do you know your name?" he asked gently. "Do you remember what happened?" She just stared, her chest heaving. He could see a question flicker in her eyes, a desperate search for an answer she didn't have. She gave a tiny shake of her head. The fear was now joined by a deep, heartbreaking confusion. He backed away, leaving a tray with a bowl of broth and a cup of water on the small table by the bed. "I'll leave you be. Eat if you can." He closed the door quietly, but the image of her terrified eyes was burned into his mind. This wasn't just about a broken body anymore. This was about a shattered mind, and he had no idea how to navigate that. The days that followed fell into a tense, silent routine. He'd leave food at her door. Later, he'd find the plate empty. He'd catch glimpses of her, a shadow moving behind the curtain of the spare room. The silence from that room was heavier than any silence he'd known before. It wasn't a silence of peace. It was a silence made of fear and loss. He didn't know what to call her. In his mind, she was just the woman. But Owen, his son, wasn't afraid of the silence. One afternoon, Nathaniel found him sitting on the floor right outside her closed door, humming a little song to himself. "What are you doing, son?" Nathaniel asked. "Singing to the lady," Owen said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "So she won't feel so alone." The simple innocence of it hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. He'd forgotten how to offer comfort without wanting something in return. The next day, something changed. He found the door to her room was open, just a crack. He peeked inside. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Owen push a little wooden horse across the floor. She was still tense, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. But she hadn't shut the boy out. She was letting him in. It was Owen who finally gave her a name. His mother used to tell him a story about a gentle river spirit named Neva. One day, he pointed right at the woman and said, clear as a bell, "Her name is Neva." The woman looked at the boy, and for the first time, something other than raw fear flickered in her eyes. She didn't correct him. She didn't speak at all. But from that day on, when Nathaniel hesitantly used the name, she would respond with a slight nod. It was something to hold on to in the great empty blankness of her mind, a gift from a child. Slowly, carefully, the woman they called Neva began to emerge. It started with small things. She'd step out into the main room, but only when Nathaniel was outside. Her movements were silent, graceful as a deer. He would come back inside to find the dishes had been washed and stacked, or the floor had been swept clean. She wasn't doing it as payment. It was like she was searching for a purpose, any small task to anchor herself in a world that made no sense. He started talking to her. He didn't expect her to reply. He just wanted to fill the heavy silence. He told her about the ranch, the changing seasons, the stubbornness of his cattle. He talked about Owen, and his voice would get softer. He never talked about his wife. And he never, ever talked about the hollow ache in his chest that was shaped like a long-lost Lakota girl. One evening, he was by the fire, mending a piece of harness. He glanced up and found her watching him. Her gaze wasn't fearful anymore. It was curious. Her broken arm was healing, held in the crude splint he'd made. "The stitches on that are uneven," she said. Her voice was husky from not being used, the words soft, but clear. Nathaniel froze. He was so stunned he couldn't move. It was the first time she had started a conversation. He looked down at the clumsy stitching in his hands. "It'll hold," he mumbled, his own voice sounding rough. She stood up and came closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She knelt beside him. She pointed a slender finger at the leather. "If you pull the awl through at an angle like this," she said, her voice finding a new confidence, "the thread will lie flat. It will be stronger." She took a scrap piece of leather and his awl and showed him. Her hands, though still bruised from her ordeal, moved with a sureness, a muscle memory that had somehow survived whatever nightmare had stolen her name and her past. He wordlessly handed her the harness. She sat by the fire and began to unpick his clumsy work, her brow furrowed in concentration. They sat there in a new kind of silence, not an empty one, but a shared one. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the thread passing through the leather. That night was a turning point. A fragile truce was turning into a tentative companionship. She started joining him and Owen for meals. Her quiet presence at their small table was a revolution. She rarely spoke, but she listened. She learned the rhythm of their days. She had a gentle touch in the garden, a way of coaxing new life from the dry soil. Sometimes she would hum a strange melody, a tune that sounded ancient and sad, a song with no words that felt like the ghost of a memory. Nathaniel found himself watching her, studying her face, looking for any clue to who she had been. He saw a deep strength in her, a resilience that humbled him. She had lost everything, even her own self. And yet, she wasn't broken. She was finding a way to grow again. But that kind of closeness doesn't go unnoticed. Not in a small town like Redemption. The place ran on gossip, and on his rare trips for supplies, Nathaniel could feel the weight of prying eyes. A white rancher, a widower, living with a nameless native woman. It was fuel for the worst kind of talk. Sheriff Miller, a man who saw the world in hard lines of black and white, made sure to stop him outside the general store. "Blackwood," he said, his voice heavy with meaning, "heard you got some company out at your place." "I have a guest," Nathaniel said, his voice flat, his jaw tight. "A guest?" Miller scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Nathaniel's boot. "A guest who doesn't have a name? A squaw you found half dead? Folks are nervous, Blackwood. Been trouble with renegades up north. Could be she's one of them. Could be her people are looking for her, and they won't be friendly when they show up." "She was hurt and alone," Nathaniel said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I did what any decent man would do." "Decency can get a man killed," Miller warned, his eyes narrowing. "You got a boy to think of. You'd be wise to send her on her way. Or, I can take her off your hands. Put her somewhere she can't cause any trouble." The threat was clear as day. The image of Neva, with her haunted eyes and quiet strength, locked in one of Miller's filthy cells. It was unbearable. A fierce, protective instinct flared up in Nathaniel's chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. "She's under my protection, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She stays." He rode home with a cold rage simmering in his gut. The world and its ugly prejudices were closing in. He had tried to build a fortress to keep it all out, but it had found him anyway. It was threatening the fragile peace he was just beginning to find with the woman who had no past. The threat didn't wait long to show its face, and it didn't come from the law. A week later, 2 men rode up to his ranch. They weren't from redemption. They had the hard, merciless look of men who lived by the gun. One was a hulking brute with a scarred face. The other was wiry and had the shifty eyes of a weasel. Nathaniel met them on the porch, his rifle held loose in his hands. He'd made sure Owen and Neva were inside, out of sight. "We're looking for someone," the scarred man said. No preamble, no "how do you do." His eyes scanned the cabin, cold and assessing. He said his name was Vance. "A Cheyenne woman. Ran off from us during that storm. Heard you might have found her." "I don't know who you're talking about," Nathaniel lied. His heart started pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Vance let out a low, ugly chuckle. "Don't play dumb, rancher. We tracked her this far. She saw something she shouldn't have. We just want to tie up a loose end. Give her to us, and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you. Or the boy." Through the window, Nathaniel saw a flicker of movement. It was Neva, pulling Owen away from the door, deeper into the house. Her face was a mask of dawning horror. A memory, violent and terrifying, was breaking through. Her hand went to her temple, and she swayed on her feet. These were the men. These were the men who had hurt her. The choice was no choice at all. It was a certainty that came from a place deeper than thought. "You're not welcome here," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Get off my land." The weasel-like man's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Vance held up a hand, stopping him. "All right, rancher, have it your way." He gave Nathaniel a smile that had no warmth in it at all. It was a predator's smile. "But we'll be back. And when we come back, we won't be so polite." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a thick, heavy tension hanging in the air. Nathaniel knew it wasn't an idle threat. They'd be back, and it would be under the cover of darkness. He went inside, his mind racing. The cabin, which had been his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Neva was huddled in a corner with Owen, her arms wrapped around the boy. She was trembling, but it wasn't for herself. It was a terror that was radiating from a newly opened memory. They killed a man," she whispered, her eyes wide with the horror of it. "A prospector. They took his gold." So that was it. She was a witness. A loose end. Nathaniel looked at the raw memory surfacing in her eyes, and then at his son. The fortress he had built was about to come under siege. "We'll be ready for them," he said, but the words felt small and weak against the storm that was coming. Night fell like a black shroud. Nathaniel barred the door and shuttered the windows. He had Owen lie on a pallet behind the big stone fireplace, the safest place in the house. Neva refused to hide. She stood by the hearth, her face pale in the firelight, but her eyes were resolute. She was clutching a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. They were in this together. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the old log house, every howl of the wind outside sounded like approaching death. They came in the darkest hour, just before the dawn. The silence was shattered by the splintering crash of a window shutter being torn from its hinges. "Stay with the boy!" Nathaniel yelled, grabbing his rifle. A shot exploded from the darkness outside. The lantern on the table shattered, plunging the room into a confusing chaos of moonlight and shadow. He fired back toward the window. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the small cabin. He saw a shape fall back outside. One down. But then the front door shuddered under a heavy blow. The wooden bar was groaning, straining. He knew it wouldn't hold for long. Vance's voice bellowed from outside. "Last chance, Blackwood! Send out the squaw!" Nathaniel moved to brace the door with his shoulder, but it was too late. The weasel-like man was already scrambling through the broken window. He raised his pistol, aiming right at Nathaniel's back. Before Nathaniel could even turn, a dark shape flew through the air. Neva had moved with the speed of a striking snake. She swung the heavy iron poker with every ounce of her strength. The iron connected with the man's head with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. Just then, the door burst inward, the bar splintering into pieces. Vance stood there, framed in the doorway, a massive, terrifying silhouette against the pre-dawn gloom. He fired. A searing, white-hot pain ripped through Nathaniel's left shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the floor. His whole arm went numb. Vance stepped into the room, a triumphant sneer twisting his scarred face. Should have listened, rancher. He raised his gun, the muzzle a dark, empty eye. He aimed it at Nathaniel's chest. But he'd forgotten about Neva. She launched herself at him, not with the poker this time, but with her whole body, a desperate, snarling whirlwind of fury. She was no match for his size, but her attack was so sudden, so feral, that it bought Nathaniel a single, precious second. He lunged for his fallen rifle with his good arm. But Vance was too strong. He threw her off him with a brutal shove. She fell hard, her shoulder slamming against the sharp corner of the table. The sleeve of her deerskin dress tore from shoulder to elbow. She lay there, dazed. The moonlight from the open door fell across her exposed arm, and Nathaniel saw it. Just below her shoulder, stark against her skin, was a small, perfectly formed birthmark. It was in the shape of a crescent moon. Time stopped. The roaring in his ears faded away. The pain in his shoulder was gone. He wasn't in his cabin in 1885 anymore. He was a boy of 10, sitting by a creek with a laughing girl. He was tracing that exact same mark on her arm with a blade of grass, telling her it was where the moon had kissed her before she was born. Winona, he breathed. The name was torn from a place of grief so deep he thought it had been buried forever. The sound of her true name, a name she hadn't heard in an eternity, seemed to cut through Vance's murderous concentration. He glanced from Nathaniel to the woman on the floor, his brow furrowing in confusion. That single moment of hesitation was all Nathaniel needed. Fueled by a sudden raging storm of adrenaline and 20 years of buried love and loss, he scrambled for the rifle, swung it up with his good arm, and fired from the hip. The shot echoed through the small cabin with the finality of a closing door. Vance crumpled to the ground. It was over. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The only sounds were Owen's frightened whimpers from behind the fireplace and Nathaniel's own ragged, painful breaths. The fire in his shoulder roared back to life, but it was a distant thing, a faint signal from a world that had just been turned completely upside down. He stumbled over to the woman on the floor. He knelt beside her, his good hand shaking as he reached out. Not to the wound on her head, but to the mark on her arm. He touched it, his fingers tracing the impossible, familiar shape. It was real. Winona, he said again, his voice cracking with the sheer impossibility of it all. Her eyes, which had been dazed with pain, slowly focused on his face. She looked at his hand on her arm, at the birthmark, and then back up into his eyes. The name echoed in the vast, empty rooms of her mind. Winona. It wasn't a memory, not yet, but it was a sound that fit. It was a key, turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. A single perfect tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Nathaniel, she whispered. The name was a ghost on her lips, a fragment of a life she couldn't remember, but a heart, it seemed, could never forget. The weeks that followed were like living in a waking dream. Nathaniel's shoulder healed, leaving a dull ache that served as a constant physical reminder of the night his entire world tilted on its axis. But the real healing, the deep healing, was happening in the quiet spaces between them. Winona's memory didn't come back in a sudden flood. It came in small, unpredictable trickles. The scent of pine needles on the wind would bring a fleeting image of 2 children hiding in a forest. The taste of wild berries would bring the phantom echo of a shared laugh. He never pushed her. He didn't pressure her to remember. He just started telling her stories. He told her about a boy and a Lakota girl who believed the creek that ran between their lands was their own secret kingdom. He told her about the promises they made to always be friends, to find each other no matter what happened. He spoke of his grief, not just for his wife, but for the girl he had lost so long ago. The girl who had impossibly, miraculously, come home. She would listen for hours, her dark eyes fixed on his face, absorbing the pieces of her own lost life. She was still Neva, the quiet, resilient woman who had survived a nightmare. But now, she was also becoming Winona again. The girl with the moon-kissed birthmark and a shared history with the solemn rancher and his bright-eyed son. Owen, with the simple, uncomplicated wisdom of a child, accepted it all without question. "So, Neva is your friend, Pa?" he asked one day, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Nathaniel looked across the room, his gaze meeting Winona's. A small, real smile touched her lips. "Yes, son," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "She's my oldest friend." One evening, they were all standing on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky in brilliant shades of rose and gold. Owen was already asleep inside. The house was quiet. The harsh, lonely land no longer felt like a prison to Nathaniel. It felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a witness to a miracle. "I remember the color," Winona said softly. Her voice was getting stronger every day. "You told me the sky was blushing because the sun was kissing it goodnight." Nathaniel turned to her, his heart swelling so much he thought it might burst. It was the first complete memory she had offered up. A perfect, polished stone pulled from the rushing river of her past. He looked into her eyes and he didn't see a stranger anymore, or a victim. He saw the person who had known him before the world had laid all its heavy burdens on his shoulders. "I remember," he said, his voice choked with feeling. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "I remember everything." The silence that fell between them wasn't empty or tense anymore. It was full. It was the comfortable, easy quiet of two souls who had found their way back to each other across an impossible chasm of time and pain. The wind still whispered through the cottonwood trees, but to Nathaniel, it no longer sounded like ghosts and grief. It sounded like a song of resilience, of unexpected kindness, and of a love that had simply refused to be forgotten. Out there on the high plains, under a sky bruised with the first stars, Nathaniel Blackwood was no longer alone. What a story of survival, identity, and the unbreakable bonds of the past. If you enjoyed this journey into the strange, dark, and mysterious, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next.